Any lumberjack would have jumped out and strangled somebody for fun by now, Decker once said. Arkansas-born Decker was in another platoon. This unkempt, dishevelled fellow, who even his army hedgehog looked dishevelled, stayed close to his close friend and fellow countryman, Captain Morris. They were constantly interjecting some southern aphorism satisfied as a dead hedgehog under a blazing sun. Morris was in his 40s, and his joking conversations with Decker did not conceal his excitement. He slicked back his thinning black hair, sparing no briolin, and pressed his lips together thoughtfully. Years of concentration had not gone to waste. He was into modelling. He'd managed to get the blueprints for the Croton from the chief bosun, so he spent most of his time building a detailed model of the ship. He even added rust in all the right places. When I was tired of looking at the ocean, reading or playing chess, I enjoyed watching Morris work. It was a mesmerizing sight. His smooth movements and peaceful face indicated that he was crazy about the process. But why Croton? Morris explained that the Croton was sort of the last aircraft carrier. I liked and respected Morris. He clearly had a better handle on these endlessly dragging days than I did. If I were asked my favorite time of day, I'd pick sunset time. Once, as I stood on the bow and watched the sun sink into the sea, an outline loomed on the horizon in the distance. The Croton was not alone in the ocean. Contact with the strangers. We are not alone. A soldier came up to me, leaned his elbows on the steel side, and stared through large binoculars. Something black, like a sea serpent, was wriggling up ahead. Looks like a branch from a tree, he noted. There's something sitting on it. I don't know what it is yet. We waited. Seagulls, the guy announced to the growing crowd. They're sitting with their backs to us. I don't think they saw us. The Croton was on a counter course to the 20-footer and her 2 passengers. I turned around and looked at the captain's bridge, which was on the right side of the takeoff deck. A man in a T-shirt was standing outside and pointing ahead. The guys are going to run over the birds, Decker, who had just arrived, said. It's like shoving a dog or scattering garbage. By then, more than 50 people were crowded on the bow of the carrier. I was standing just off the side. The seagulls wouldn't leave the roost, and they weren't in any hurry to notice us. They had found the only suitable place in the middle of the Pacific to take a breather. I leaned over the side to see the moment of impact. Bullseye. The branch snapped apart. The seagulls tried to push off and take off, but they were swept over by the wave. They disappeared. A few seconds later, on the starboard side of the ship, about 20 feet from the bow, first one, and then a second bird emerged from the sea foam, shaking their heads and beating their wings on the water. Liz and I hung over the starboard rail as the Bataan Peninsula sailed by. Blue-grey hills rose above the sea horizon. It was the only piece of land we'd seen on our way from California to Vietnam. Liz gazed silently at the islands in the distance. He had once landed a glider there. What was that like? I asked him. The real heat, he turned to me and smiled. The worst feeling of my life. Back then, the fucking gliders didn't land, they went down. I thought I could work out all the techniques during training, but with a bunch of soldiers inside, the gliders were turning into fucking pieces of metal. He only swore when it came to gliders. You crashed the plane? Well, I left on my own 2 feet, so we'll consider it a landing. People were maimed in my plane. People died in other planes. The gliders were a horrible idea. Our Hueys will at least be able to fly back when we drop off the units. What did you do after you landed? Surviving. That's the goal. Land the plane, then get to your troops however you want. Some didn't make it. Holy shit. How did you even become a glider pilot? All the students in the flight school course were suddenly reclassified as glider pilot candidates and sent overseas. For no reason. Yesterday we flew turboprop trainer planes. The next day we're flying gliders. You flew in Korea too? Tactical Air Unit. How was it? More or less. At least the planes had engines. I liked flying them. Why'd you quit your job and go into aviation? Hell if I know. I guess I like flying too much. I like flying combat missions. They're like a test. I'm ready to shit my pants every time, but I like the feeling. The Air Mobile Brigade was a good decision. My office desk was starting to look more and more like a coffin. You know what I mean? I nodded uncertainly. You see, at least it'll be fast in battle, he grinned. Have you set the anchors to drop yet? I asked Kaiser. Hell no. It's only assholes who do that shit, he said, keeping his eyes on the dice. Anyone who spends money on guessing the exact time the anchor will drop is an asshole, he added. I bet a buck on 937, Connors said. What an asshole. That's why my mum was so upset. I bet a buck myself, but I didn't mention it. The day before we landed, the ship was a buzzing hive of activity. We received an unspoken order to take usable surplus equipment off the ship to set up a ground camp. Ensign Wall confirmed that some musty old mattresses could be taken off the ship, and then went on a detour with Colonel Dogwell to discuss exactly what items we were allowed to load into the Huey. While hundreds of soldiers scoured all the bays for junk, others were busy getting the Huey ready for departure. The vinyl covering of the flight deck was ripped off and thrown overboard. A few days in the fresh sea air wouldn't hurt the machines. The crates of rotor blades were lifted onto the deck for later sorting and installation so that the Hueys on the flight deck would be ready for departure as soon as they arrived in Quinyon. The remaining vehicles, including Liz and I's helicopter, were to be up there by means of a lift platform after the flight deck was cleared. It was expected to take 3 days to assemble, inspect, load and depart all the Hueys. All the utensils from the impromptu hunt were stored in the helicopters. Working crews of enlisted men, warrant officers, and lieutenants dragged mattresses, coils of wire and cable, scraps of tarps, tools, and even pieces of wood onto the hangar deck and stashed them in the Huey's cargo hold. We had gotten far from trash. The mattresses were new, and so were the tool ropes. Yeah, we cleaned out the whole ship. The carrier was headed back to the States after we landed, where it could be reloaded with equipment. We were going to be in the jungle, far from our homeland, so we clung to every opportunity to make our existence easier. I supported this attitude to a certain extent, but I still felt a pang of conscience when I saw how much we had crammed into the helicopters. Before arriving, I had the assistant bosun build a holster for my Derringer. In return, I provided him with several dozen compact P-38 canning knives from the dry packs. On the last hectic day of the voyage, he handed me the finished holster. Leather straps covered my shoulders and were connected by an elastic band on my back. A holster was sewn to the belt under my left shoulder. I slipped the weighty Derringer into it under the aide's proud gaze. Because of the weight of the gun, the holster was tight against my body and unnoticeable from the outside. Maybe the gun would save my life, maybe I would shoot myself with it to avoid capture. I didn't fully realize how I could use it. When I climbed out of the cabin and looked overboard, the grey outline of land was already unmistakable in the distance. 2 hours later, we entered Lang Mai Bay, south of Quinyon, and prepared to anchor. The landing helicopter carrier Iwo Jima was on our right side, and on our left side were 10 cargo ships of the naval agency Likes Line, arriving on military orders. The anchor slipped into the water on September 13th after 11 o'clock in the morning. It took us 31 days to get here from Mobile. The rest of our division sailed a week later and arrived a week earlier. While the helicopters prepared for departure, the pilots hung around on the upper decks and watched the action on the neighboring helicopter carrier. Navy pilots motored large Sikorsky H-34s from the sliding deck to the fog bank and back. The Navy landing craft used helicopters in a different pattern. We were to live with the soldiers in the field, while the naval pilots travelled back to the safety and comfort of the ship each day. This was not easy for us to accept. Iwo Jima was one of the ships that took part in the Battle off Chulai Base, which took place while we were en route. The battle was described as the first full-scale engagement since Korea, involving more than 5,000 US and Vietnamese ground troops and naval artillery. The total number of Viet Cong killed was 700 soldiers. The States lost 50 Marines. The Vietnamese Army's losses were of little concern to anyone. By the middle of the second day of fighting, the Viet Cong Army had given up resistance. Boots, shells, and munitions were strewn haphazardly across the field, and the ground was gaping with large black scars still smoking from napalm. Parts of enemy soldiers' bodies hung from trees and bushes, but lying in shelters and caves, the battle, according to time, proved that a combination of accurate intelligence, quick planning, and skillful timing of the battle allowed the United States to significantly strengthen its position in Vietnam. The combination of US, Marines, ground units of Viet Cong soldiers, heavy assault troops, and artillery support resulted in a huge number of dead Vietnamese. Time spoke of more than 2,000 Viet Cong dead, but no one knew what part of that figure had to do with the harmless villagers caught in the crossfire. "I'll say this," said Decker, "everybody who had the brains to walk in front of bullets got what they deserved." Decker, "They found several dead 10-year-olds in these villages. You think they're Viet Cong?" Wendell objected. "Maybe," Decker replied, "and maybe not. But this is war. War spares no one. Hell, we can't keep mourning the innocent victims. They've been dying in battles since time immemorial. If we're going to win this mess, we need to realize where we are in an ordinary, dirty, and ruthless war." "That's right," Connors seconded. "Either we fight this war or we don't. Our troops are here, and the gooks will shit themselves when they see us in action. It's too late to wonder why we're here. We're already here." Captain Sherman and John Hall, the warrant officer from our advance party, brought in bags of letters that had accumulated over the voyage. I spent a lot of time reading a dozen letters from patients. I have some excerpts saved. "I miss you very much, my love. Today I lay down on Susie's bed and imagined you lying next to me and trying to comfort me. I'm going to write to Louise now and ask if Jane can come to Naples. I wish you were here. I can imagine the despondency on the ship. I am more fun. Come to the Casbah with me. Bobby, I miss you so much. I'm trying to keep myself busy. Your dad came by. We picked up the Panama Canal tape. Should I send you the pictures or leave them at home? One photo's blurry. But the one of you, you look so handsome. So tanned. When your father left, I walked with the stroller to Sunshine, bought a bottle of Coppertone, and went to the beach for a swim. It's 2:00 in the afternoon, there's a thunderstorm outside, and all I can think about is how we showered together, played Monopoly, kissed, made love, and held each other's hands. I miss you so much I'd die, but I won't because you'll come back. Come back soon. I want to be transported to next August. Jack misses you. Trust me, he looks at all the men and is always saying, Papa, when he is happy or revitalized. I love you. I love you so much. I cringe to think that just a short time ago we were living together, goofing around, making fun of Jack, and fiddling with our kitty. I can't believe you're gone, even though you really are. Please write more often. Remember those old war movies where the soldier sits in the trench, knee-deep in water, shells exploding all around him, and he's writing a letter to his girlfriend on a scrap of toilet paper. Write to me too. Jack just said down when he wanted to get out of his chair. Last night during dinner, a kitten was meowing under his high chair, and he looked down at it and said meow. I love writing to you. I immediately feel safe, feel like I'm doing something. But now it's time to call it a day. I love you better than anyone in the world, Patience. All right, boys, we're going into the thick of it, Major Fields announced. We were assembled in the break room for a briefing, and Fields tapped on a map taped to the door. Our camp is 2 miles north of this village, he pointed to a spot. The village is called An Key, and it lies halfway between Quinion and Pleiku, on a stretch of road called Route 19 that stretches 100 miles from east to west. This whole area. He circled the map with his hand, is considered Viet Cong territory. The track was opened by the Vietnamese army in July. Our division will be the first to be in the middle of the Viet Cong's possessions, and our task is to be on their heads to squeeze them out of there, without delay. He smiled, tapping the documents on the table. When you reach this area, your route will be along the highway. Stay high up. All the small villages you'll come across in the southern part of the valley are under Viet Cong control, and some ships have already reported snipers striking 1,000 feet up. Go 40 miles inland and you should find this pass, An Key Pass, which will be considered the end of the valley and the beginning of the highlands. The base camp of the division is here, about 10 miles above the pass, on the high ground. It is said to be cool and sleepable. Our division will be settling into a large area. It's still being cleared. The helicopter station is at 3,000 to 4,000 feet, with camps for nearly 20,000 troops around it. Fields took a sip of coffee. When you get there, you'll be told about the camp, the area of operations, and other details. I haven't had a chance to go there in person yet. Fields pulled a piece of paper from a pile of papers with a list of FM, UHF, and VHF bands and corresponding frequencies neatly printed next to it. The radio call signs for our pastor company. Write down the numbers. They will change when you arrive at camp, but your radios should be set correctly for the duration of the flight. We ducked into our pocket notebooks and transcribed the information. Now to the junk that's stuffed in the helicopters. Fields paused, letting an understanding chuckle pass over his ears. I don't know what you've gotten away with, and I don't want to know. He smiled and shook his head. But I have to tell you that the fleet representatives, Ensign Wall, are missing some of the supplies that have been banned. As far as I'm concerned, no one in our company would dare steal from a ship, even out of greed, but I'll have to take my complaint upstairs. The Major smiled affectionately at his mischievous charges. Well, there's nothing more to add, except that we'll start taking off at 20-minute intervals today. The last Huey should be leaving Croton in 2 days. You've received your missions, maps, and radio frequencies. Any questions? Yes, Sir Banjo cheered. Has the advance party prepared tents for us yet? Nofta. I'm sure they have, Banjo. They've laid the carpets, whipped the featherbeds, and filled the baths. By 11 o'clock the next morning, Liz, myself, and senior mechanic, specialist 5th rank Don Richer, were ready for departure. Along with the work crew, Richer had prepped our Huey in advance. Liz and I did a thorough pre-flight inspection. A mountain of puffy mattresses and 20 dense pine decks lay beneath drab pieces of tarp in the cargo hold. Liz took over the takeoff, which I was glad of. Connors and Banjo were launching the machine 75 feet away. The engine was running at full speed, and I watched the propeller disc dangle back and forth while Connors checked the controls. I stood at the nose of the Huey and just watched. A slight breeze blew over me as Connors pulled the pitch throttle. The disc flexed and the propeller began to lift the car off the deck. Connors hovered a few seconds 5 feet above the surface. Then I was hit by a powerful jet from the propeller and smelled the sweet kerosene smell of warm turbine exhaust. He turned the machine around and flew off the carrier toward Quinion, where he was to refuel. After 32 days of waiting, we were finally leaving the ship. Liz and I were next to depart. I fumbled for a pack of cigarettes and a notebook in the breast pocket of my field jacket. My .45 caliber Army Colt sat firmly in a black leather holster on top of my Derringer stash. I examined my uniform absent-mindedly. The buckle of my waist belt was wrapped with a green ribbon. The military pants hung baggy and almost entirely concealed my field boots. I wasn't used to flying in such attire. We'd always worn overalls before. Liz managed to talk to someone at the edge of the flight deck, while Connors took off. Then he came back. Let's go. I opened the left door, put my foot on the landing gear, and leaned in to grab the far corner of the armored seat. Liz was doing the same thing through the right door, and my control stick jerked when he caught his foot in mine. I slipped my foot between the handle and the chair and lowered myself into the nylon mesh. Reacher, who was standing at my door, handed me the shoulder straps and the cord from the radio. I pulled back the lock to snap the shoulder straps into the wide waist belt. The older mechanic of the car behind us helped Liz with his straps. Once buckled in, Liz unclipped the inertia reel to lean forward and do an instrument check. He started at the bottom of the center panel from his left foot, and then ran his hand over all the switches and fuses, checking their position. He then reached over to the top of the panel between us and made sure the radios were off. I understood his maneuver and tuned into the proper frequencies. I pulled on my brand new leather flight gloves, but they would only last 2 weeks in this climate. Liz squeezed the ignition circuit fuse on the overhead console and announced, "Okay, we're ready to launch." We put on our flight helmets. I grabbed the bottom edges of mine, pulled them apart, and slid my head inside. I forgot to pull the earpieces off with the laces on the outside, causing the left earpiece to jam crookedly into my ear. I pulled the loop of the lanyard on the left side, lifted the rubber cup and corrected it. There was no sound until Liz flicked the communal switch. He pressed the communication button on his control stick to the first click and asked, "Ready?" I gave a thumbs up. He looked through his door window for the duty officer with the fire extinguisher. The duty officer was there. He nodded, and the guy waved the red tank back. Liz turned the engine control knob to the start position and depressed the switch on his general pitch lever. The electric starter roared shrilly. The propellers began to slowly accelerate. A loud whooshing sound overlapping the squealing of the starter meant that a flame had erupted in the turbine. Liz kept a close eye on the temperature gauge of the exhaust gases. The arrow darted past the red line, and the propellers merged into spinning blobs. As usual, the instrument arrow hovered in the danger zone for only a couple seconds before returning to green operating readings. Liz gave a thumbs up to the guy with the fire extinguisher. The hot start went perfectly. The Huey ran like clockwork after a whole month of downtime in the hangar. I went over the gauges on my side of the panel. Everything's in the green zone. Everything okay outside? Liz put Reacher on the intercom. Yes, sir, everything's fine. We were to fly without a gunner. The deck rocked as the Croton anchored. Liz moved the engine control knob to the operating position and quickly checked the blurry outline of the carrier propeller disc for movement by jerking the control stick. As he slowly pulled the general pitch lever upward, the Huey's nose cocked up in a characteristic way, and Liz adjusted for a possible drift. With the car leveled, he pulled the lever and lifted us above the swaying deck. I glanced around at the circle of people gathered, their clothes flapping in the wind. Liz hovered for a few seconds at 6 feet, checked the instrument readings once more, and steered the car forward with an elusive movement of the control stick. Through the front windows at my feet, I watched the flight deck receding. The sea was churning beneath us. We were on our way. September 1965. We landed in Quingyong to fill our 1,200-pound, 200-gallon tank to the brim before flying to Anqui. The air under overcast skies was stuffy and humid. The smell of human waste was coming from the direction of the sand dunes, from behind a wire fence around the runway that appeared to be part of a citywide restroom. I saw people squatting in the middle of the dunes, scraps of toilet paper flying in the air. We stared at the people we had come to rescue like tourists. Some kid wiped himself with his bare hand and licked it off. God. Liz turned away in disgust. Liz was driving. I kept an eye on the map and our location so I could radio the coordinates in case we fell. The valley between Quin Hong and Anqui, under Viet Cong control, was a vast swamp of rice paddies. Our flight path was considered relatively safe. Liz was flying under the very clouds, at 3,000 feet. The map was speckled with names like Ndin, Luet Chan, Dai Theo, Main Duk, and hundreds of other points around Quingyong. The valley stretched 20 miles north to Bong Sun and dropped off in the hills just a kilometre south of us. The land stretched toward us in hilly fingers on the south side along the road. They were about 1,500 feet high and all in impenetrable jungle. Every now and then I saw gaps in the hills with banana groves. As Liz steered, I imagined grinning Viet Cong nestled against the butts of machine guns under the protection of the thick green cover. It suddenly dawned on me that I could be the perfect target in the event of oncoming fire. Body armor would be a nice solution. Full body armor with a visibility strip would be ideal. Returning to the ship would be a smart decision. I glanced at Liz. He smiled. The pass loomed ahead. Here, you're in command. Roger that. That. The narrow road below us began to curve around itself, climbing up the steep foothills. At the sight of the looming mountains, I couldn't resist taking the higher ground. Only about 200 feet, and we were already flying through the clouds. The world began to disappear from view for a few seconds. At the highest point of the pass, the mountains came within 800 feet of us. The empty road passed through dense jungle. A high hill called Hong Kong Hill indicated the location of our camp, 10 miles ahead. There's plenty of hiding places down there, I said. Yeah, Liz said quietly, surveying the woods. From up high, Vietnam looked like a vast green jungle. The perfect place for guerrilla warfare, especially if you're fighting on the guerrilla side. Yeah, Liz repeated. The clouds ahead parted, and the jungle emerged from the shadows, showering us with green foliage. Liz reached for the radio and switched to the company frequency. I felt the control knob ripple as he jammed the comm button. Pastor Base, calling 879, is our flight number. Roger, Pastor 879er, spit it out. Pastor 889er at the pass. Where do you want to land? Pastor 811er, contact the Gulf Zone. They'll guide you to the landing site. We're setting up at the south end of the camp, third row. We'll send someone to meet you. Come in. Come in, Pastor Base. 879, over. As the ground dived down in front of Nkei, I loosened the general pitch lever and went into a slow descent. Straight ahead of us, north of the road, stuck out Hong Kong Hill, the southern boundary of Camp Radcliffe. The Gulf Zone, with its cleared helipad, was right next to the jungle. Gulf Zone, Pastor 879, 5 miles east, waiting to land. Come in. Roger, Shepherd 879. You're cleared for a direct approach southbound on row 3. A guide will meet you. Past the camp's eastern boundary ran the rundown Song Ba River. 2 miles south, near the village of Nkei, it grew to 100 yards wide. Next to the river, between the village and the camp, was a short airstrip built by French troops. It was now being used by our division's airplanes. Liz took instructions from the Gulf area, and I took a right to make a circle, fly up to the camp on the south side and come in for a direct landing. Hold altitude, until we approached the strip Liz commanded. Understood. The sun was shining as we circled over the northern part of the jungle and turned south to approach the third runway. I began my descent about a mile from the strip, at an altitude of 1,000 feet. Our advance party had done a great job. The Gulf area was stacked with thousands of stumps. A thick forest stuck out all around. Pastor 879, ready to land. 879 cleared. I dropped a step and pulled the control stick toward me to level the car for landing. The top of Hong Kong Hill began to grow on the horizon to the right as I headed for a descent. As we approached the Gulf Zone, we saw an extremely bumpy course. Look at those stumps. Yeah. 6 straight rows of parallel helicopters were separated by vehicle roads that wound through mud, ravines, and bumps. Khaki-coloured tents, trucks, tank trailers, jeeps, and people scattered haphazardly across the cleared area at the very end of the southern end of the Gulf Zone, where we were now to live. At 500 feet, I flew into a clearing among the trees forming the northern boundary of the camp. The start of the zone was still 500 feet away. Nestled between the trees, I could see hundreds of camping tents. Thousands of our soldiers were stationed around the winding perimeter, guarding the rest of us. At 200 feet, I began to slow down sharply and level the Huey for landing. Just above my dashboard, at the south end of the Gulf Zone, I saw a man waving his arms as he stood on the roof of the Jeep. Do you see him? That's right, I responded. I hovered high-centered over the uneven dirt rut. I was worried I might hit the bumpy ground with the tail rotor. The man who had been waving at us was now pointing toward a landing spot between 2 other cars. My lack of experience made itself felt. I pushed the tail rotor pedals too hard, and the car staggered toward the spot. The tail rotor pedals on the Huey take some getting used to, Liz encouraged me. A month ago I had no problem with those pedals. Now I was pushing them like a cadet. What are you going to do? I begged. It's all right, Bob. It'll take you a while to get the feel of the car. You know experience is everything. Liz used the floor torque switch to keep me from touching the control knob while I hung in the air. I flew over a tall stump and pointed the nose of the helicopter toward the spot. The tail of the helicopter went into a reverse gradient. As I pulled the control stick back to stop, I had the tail rotor crashing into the dirt in front of me. A Huey is a helicopter with a low-slung tail, and I was being overly cautious. Lowered the machine down so gently that a gust of wind lifted us up. I oversteered the control stick, and we plummeted. Overdid it a second time, and we jerked back up. Take it easy, Liz said. It's all right. That's how instructors communicate with nervous cadets. I felt my cheeks burning with shame. I gently touched the ground with the rear edge of the left skid, hit the ground with the rear edge of the right skid, tossed the car forward awkwardly, and stood on the skids in one piece. You just need to work out the last 3 feet before you land, Liz explained. The work in the air and on the approach is top-notch. Our ground guide ran his palm down my throat, ordering me to shut down the engine. That was my first landing on Vietnamese soil. We stuffed the flight bags into the trunk of the Jeep. Reacher stayed behind, supervising the unloading of the goodies from the Croton. As we drove the 500 yards down the ploughed track to our company site, Liz and I spotted the 5-crane helicopters I'd heard so much about. Even by helicopter standards, they looked bulky. They were frame helicopters designed to lift loads up to 20,000 pounds. Underneath were neatly arranged portable, pre-loaded shipping containers the size of RVs, among them a fully equipped box for emergency operations. They could carry large artillery pieces, and any aircraft, including the twin-rotor Chinook normally used to haul out hit Hueys. "Welcome to Camp Radcliffe," said Captain Owens, who had joined us from the operations headquarters tent, one of 2 general-purpose tents. He resided in the rear of the tent with Chief Warrant Officer 3rd Grade White and another staff officer. "Who is Radcliffe?" Liz inquired. "A major from the advance party who died at Mangyang Pass," Owen explained. "Where is that pass?" I asked. "Up the road, about 20 miles away." Owen's khaki t-shirt was dark with sweat. On the way to Plake, he pulled his sweat-soaked cap off his head and wiped his face with the bottom of his t-shirt. Sweat dripped down his hair and hung in droplets on his stubble. The helicopter with the major had been shot at 3,000 feet above the pass with a large caliber machine gun. Hit with tracer bullets all the way down. "What's the situation here, anyway?" Liz asked, struggling to get his flight bag out of the trunk of the Jeep. It weighed more than he did. It was a mess. Owens leaned back against the front fender with his cap in his hand. A bunch of shootings every night all around the perimeter. Half of them are shooting at their own squads coming back from reconnaissance. He turned to face north. "Right there last night," he pointed. "They shot 5 guys from the scouting party while they were trying to get into the camp. My advice to you, don't hang around the camp at night. You'll get a line from the psycho thugs. Don't blame them for that, there are plenty of real Viet Cong around. The camp has no physical boundaries, so no one knows where its territory ends. The sentries are terrified, shooting at anyone who moves or makes noise." Owens laughed suddenly, pulling his cap back over his head. "The sentries put about 100 bullets in a buffalo a couple days ago." "Where are we sleeping?" Liz asked. "You should set up a camping tent for the duration of your stay. The platoon tents haven't arrived yet, probably lying on some ship in the farthest container. The major ordered us to stop on this side." Owens waved his hand in the direction of the tent, which stood 100 feet away. "Good luck," he said. That rainy night I wrote a letter to Paynes in the tent by candlelight. I told her how much it hurt to be away from home, how much I missed Jack, and how much I loved her. In the darkness I could hear the crackle of small-caliber weapons. I once chatted with a guy in Belvoir who was bragging about his fancy trip to Vietnam. He had an ocean view villa, booze-hungry maids, casino trips, and good connections at the garrison store. He was attached to a group of counselors who worked all along the coast, shuttling dignitaries from one military special forces camp to another. I thought of him and cursed my fate. The next morning the company station was bustling with activity. I was just leaning against a pile of mattresses that I was going to spread out in the sun to dry when a jeep appeared in the dirt of the circular road. The colonel emerged from it. After a few words with Major Fields, he turned to us. "We've been told that some of the mattresses and other supplies have been removed from the Croton," he said, as he approached the pile of mattresses beside me. "Personally, I'm sure no one in the 229th is capable of such a thing, but you know those Marines. Complaints, 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 complaints. So I have to formally ask you soldiers if you've come across any missing mattresses, cables, wooden planking, and other utensils from the ship." I bounced off the pile of stolen goods. The colonel looked at us and smiled warmly. His eyes darkened at the sight of the pile of mattresses. He stopped his gaze on Connors. "No," Sir Connors replied. "I haven't seen anything like it, but I wouldn't mind one of those mattresses." "I believe you would," son, said the colonel, nodding good-naturedly. "Does anyone else have any information about the missing supplies from the Croton?" The colonel asked, stepping toward the general-purpose tent. Nate, standing next to the tarp door, answered. "No, sir." Haven't seen anything like that around here. A huge skein of cables lay beside him. Negative, Saricha replied, leaning against a stack of wooden planks. Nothing, Sir Kaiser replied. 20 pairs of innocent eyes sincerely denied the existence of the ship's goods lying in plain view. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for your time and cooperation. The colonel smiled and turned to Fields, who escorted him back to the jeep. While the sun dried our supplies, Fields gathered everyone for a briefing. A tripod with a map stood just in front of the operations tent. Fields was wearing his new field uniform for the jungle and boots issued by the advance team. Everyone else was waiting for their kits. The jungle uniform fit loosely. The top was not normally tucked in, it looked more like a safari-type jacket. The boots had canvas tops and perforations to keep the feet dry. Now, gentlemen, since you're all here, I'll outline the situation. Fields pulled out his folding pointer. The mess you saw yesterday in the Gulf area was the 227th Airborne Helicopter Battalion of our unit going to assist the 101st. He unfolded the pointer and folded it back up with a click. They were pulling out our paratroopers who were caught in a mess and lost several vehicles with personnel. Exact details are still unknown. As it turned out later, 4 vehicles were shot down, 1 crew was missing. He unfolded the pointer and turned to the map. This briefing is necessary for you to study the location of the camp and understand your objectives for the next 2 weeks. Fields pointed to the camp plan on the first page of the large clipboard. Our 4 companies are centered here, under the southeastern part of the Gulf zone. He described the camp plan to us, then stopped and tore off the sheet, revealing a new plan. This is the layout of Bravo Company. He poked at the map. Please note that this road here is not on the ground yet. He pointed to the medical tent that served as the boundary between us and the company they called Snakes. Nor is this trench, or this bunker, or all these tents. To organize all these things in the right places will be our job for the near future. Flights can only be flown for the transportation of high command or courier communications. We need to finish setting up camp before the fighting starts. Everyone will be working, everyone, including officers, warrant officers, non-commissioned officers, and enlisted men. Every morning there will be lineups for work. There will be enough tasks for everyone. In addition, some of you will go to the Gulf area to uproot all the stumps. Fields paused as some of the crowd turned around to look at the thousands of stumps sticking up on the 275-acre helipad. So we're not going to use machinery to get these things outside? Decker asked. Exactly. We turned back to Fields. We're not using machinery to get the dirt out. When the dry season comes, we'll choke on the dust. We looked again at the slushy trails and bumps. It just couldn't get any worse. And where would we put the dug-up stumps? Decker was very interested in the uprooting operation. We're going to loosen a few at a time and haul them to the Huey. We'll dump them nearby. In the meantime, 1 squad will be busy filling sandbags for the bunkers. 1 squad will be busy paving the road. 1 squad will be busy paving the road. 1 squad will be busy digging trenches, and 1 squad will be busy laying telephone lines. Somehow all the privileges of being an Army Air Corps pilot got by me. I was digging trenches along the company road. Wrestler, Banjo, Connors, Nate, Riker, and Kaiser were digging with me. We were digging out a small stump in the middle of the road when suddenly a green snake flashed at the roots. Look, a snake, Banjo yelled. That's right, said Connors. Let's get it. The snake tried to hide back under the protection of the roots. Armed with various sticks, shovels, axes, and other hand tools, we rolled the stump aside and surrounded the snake. Is it poisonous? Nate asked. Nope, Connors replied. It's a green snake. They're plentiful back home. Connors jerked sharply as the snake he'd been trying to pin down with a stick made a furious lunge. Damn. They hadn't acted like this before. Fuck, Connors. What are you afraid of a common sting? Banjo laughed. He crouched down and reached for the snake with his rod. Captain Farris came up at the noise of the commotion. Don't touch the snake, he shouted. It's a bamboo kufia, deadly poisonous. The ranks of snake hunters quickly thinned. Poisonous? Banjo pounced on Connors. God damn it, Connors, I almost got the damn thing. It's a regular fucking thing. It's green, isn't it? Connors fought back. Yes, agreed Faris. It's a green bamboo kufia. Faris took the shovel from Resler and in one swift motion drove the blade across the snake into the ground. The two halves convulsed and burrowed into the dirt. The snake's mouth opened wide in its death spasms. Remember, Faris explained. Of the 33 species of snakes here, 31 are venomous. How do we tell them apart? Resler asked. Given that ratio, I authorize you to proceed without trial, just kill them all indiscriminately. Faris turned and walked away. The bags were filled to the brim with earth from the dug trenches. Our squad split up. 5 of us filled the bags, the rest of us dragged them 100 feet to the first bunker. We laid a foundation of sandbags 15 feet square, made one passage, and after much debate decided that the walls would be as thick as a sack. Once the foundation was ready, the rest of the guys in the platoon joined us to speed up the process. By late afternoon, the walls had grown 6 feet high. Another work party was sent out to cut large trees that would become rafters for the roof. The felled trees were trimmed and adjusted to size with axes. By supper time, the rafters were set on top across the sack walls. What's that shit floating in the water? Captain Morris, the mess hall supervisor, was cursing at a bucket of boiling water. Kerosene immersion boilers were supposed to keep the bucket at a boiling temperature to sterilize our cutlery. After the first few men scooped from the bucket with their cans, the water would begin to cool and a thin film of grease and dirt would appear on its surface. Morris headed for the tent in a rage, probably to shove the man on duty. Decker studied the water squeamishly. You could bury a man in this fucking water, he said loudly. Yes, said Connors, standing behind me in the serving line. Let them bury it with whatever's already dead, he nodded in the direction of the tent dining room. That's the flavor of our dinner, Banjo said. I'm going to puke. Connors made a face and clutched his stomach. What the hell is this shit? Why can't we eat our supper in soup packs? Gainsburgers, Banjo said. We named the army canned ground beef patties with gravy after dog food. The canning process turned real meat into an inarticulate, fibrous, dried-out substance floating in grease. The line advanced inside the mess hall. Food dispensers poured, placed and scooped a bunch of miscellaneous food into the 2 compartments of my plate: Gainsburgers, instant mashed potatoes, boiled cabbage, stewed corn, and mugs of sliced canned bread. I walked back to the bunker and joined my comrades feasting on sandbags. Will there be beer tonight? Connors asked. Tomorrow. I'll run down to Quinion and pick up the load, Nate answered. Why do you always know about these things? Connors said resentfully. Luck, skill, experience and sycophancy. You know, Nate joked. He finished his meal and puffed on his pipe, as was his custom. Do you think the bunker can withstand a direct hit? Resler asked me. I'm not sure. It depends on how thick the roof is. What are we going to do about the roof, Captain Faris? Resler turned to our squad leader. I think Captain Shaker will settle for a thickness of 2 bags. Faris struggled to hold 2 pieces of his cutlery in his lap. Will it hold up to a direct hit? Nope, Faris replied. The next day after breakfast, we laid perforated steel decking, which is commonly used in road and landing strip construction, over the wooden rafters and through 2 layers of sandbags on top. The roof had sagged a bit in the middle, but you could still get inside with your head slightly ducked. From the outside, the bunker looked imposing and stable, a model for the 3 remaining structures. After lunch, we managed to work for 3 hours filling sandbags before Private First Class Byrne, a messenger from intelligence headquarters, came running to us. He looked confused. Mr. Connors, you and Banjo need to fly out right away. What's the matter? Connors threw back the shovel. Nate got hit on a beer run. Let's go, Banjo. Connors rushed to the tent. Resler, Riker, and Liz watched them. In the heat of digging and building, I had completely forgotten that there were people outside the camp who were not welcomed that night. Under the pale moonlight, we celebrated the beer flight. 4 pilots marched around the bunker, each holding a sealed can of beer in their hand. With a solemn chant of "O noble sir," they came to bow to Fields, who was chortling as he sat in a chaise lounge. The pilots placed the beer on the bunker and retreated in the same manner, with a sense of accomplishment. Of the 100 cases that Nate and Kaiser had taken from Quinion, only 4 cans had survived. The snakes had slipped us enough beer for a party. We spread out around the bunker waiting for Nate and Connor's story. I was walking at 2,000 feet with Kaiser when they hit Nate began. I couldn't see where they were sitting, only heard gunshots. 2 bursts hit the fuel line next to the engine, and after a couple seconds it went silent. Quiet's not the word Kaiser cut in. I could hear my own heartbeat. I was in auto-rotation for the first time in my life. I slowed down and started looking for a place to land. A ton of beer in the cargo hold sped up the descent, but I made it. Yeah, Kaiser interjected, you did it. Got the skids 2 fucking feet into the ground. He did it. Okay? It was a little hard. But he didn't bend anything Nate said. I don't care, he could have bent it. I'm glad you're here, Field smiled. Then what happened? Well, we ended up in the grass up to our eyeballs overlooking the jungle. When we got hit, Kaiser called for backup on the backup channel. The chief mechanic and the machine gunner got behind the guns and covered us. Nate held a smoking pipe in one hand and supported his elbow with the other. He arched his back as he spoke, waving the pipe occasionally like a pointer for effect. We sat far away from the Viet Cong anyway. There was no more shooting. About 2 minutes later, a snake chopper came to pick us up. They radioed us, checked the situation and came down. We took the radio and machine gun with us. Kaiser wanted to grab a beer, but the snakes weren't willing to wait. As soon as they got their asses in the chopper, the snakes were on the gas. Nate pointed upward. While the snakes were picking us up, Major Fields, along with Connors and Banjo, flew up in a combat chopper. We transferred to them halfway up and flew back down. From the time we left our downed vehicle to the time we got back to it again was about half an hour. Nate waved toward Connors. Was it my turn? Connors smiled. When we got there, the Gooks had done a good job. I saw them scurrying back into the jungle as we circled around. The chopper dived after them, but it was too late. When the commander gave the okay, we landed. Connors stopped, whispered something in Nate's ear, and they roared together. Guys, just so you know, the grass in that place was really tall. Connors took a sip of beer. The Gooks had really done a good job. Seems they'd been trying to disable the car, and they'd spent a lot of time chopping the seats into shreds, smearing shit all over the dashboard, throwing mud in the cab, and shoving sticks into the hellhole. In short, inventive guys. But they got one thing right. They stole every single case of beer. And that's real terrorism. But Nate added, raising his eyebrows. But they didn't notice one crate. It fell into the grass, and no one knew it existed until I landed my chopper right on top of it. Fields was already weeping with laughter. But Connors continued. I was only able to save a few cans. Connors pointed to 4 Budweisers near the bunker. We roared. Connors raised one can high and proclaimed. To the pastors. May there be more beer and less shooting. Soon the sky turned black and the first raindrops sprinkled, so the party ended early. As the storm clouds covered the moon, I remembered that I hadn't had time to dig a drainage furrow around my tent. Shit, if a snake crawls inside my tent, I'd rather lie inside and let it bite me than crawl out into the fucking rain. Resler's voice came through the tent tarp. Snake, Liz shouted. His tent was on the other side of Resler's. The rain was coming down so hard it seemed to be tearing the tarp. My tent flaps were buttoned up tightly, and I watched the streams running past the bottom edge of the tarp to the back of the tent. Where the water dripped onto the dirt floor, I had to build a drain and scratch a groove outward with a penknife. I wrote a night letter to Patience. Told her about my tent, the lack of flying, the tense perimeter situation, and the sergeant who had been bitten by a snake. He didn't check his bedroll, crawled inside and got caught. Fortunately, there was an antidote that was rumoured to be more painful than the bite. On top of the rolling thunder, I could hear the thudding sounds of mortars and artillery from neighbouring positions. The crackle of small caliber guns came from everywhere. I sympathised with the soldiers on guard duty who had to be on duty on such a night. There was a rustle inside the tent. I froze and felt something cold wriggling around my ankle. A snake. What to do? If I moved or screamed, it would sting. To the drumbeat of the rain, I was drenched in sweat in the stuffy tent. When the uninvited guest reached my knee, I recognized it and quickly threw open the side flap. A giant brown moth darted towards the neighboring tent. Snake. Snake. Connor's muffled cries overrode the rain. I poked my head outside and shined my flashlight in its direction. The place was empty. Connors and his tent spent the rest of the night in the general-purpose tent. Sitting in the tent, I pulled on my boots. The storm had stopped during the night. The morning was clear and even sunny. Morris and Decker were shaving, using their helmets in the manner of shells. I tucked my pant legs inside my boots and wandered to the makeshift urinal without wearing a t-shirt. The rain had washed away some of the ammonia odor that filled the area near the empty shell casing of the jet buried in the ground. Similar urinals were strategically placed around our company's precinct. They worked flawlessly until they overflowed. The soil absorbed as much as it could. Filled to the brim, the urinals exuded such an odor that we found them at night without a flashlight. I was thinking about going back to the tent and shaving before breakfast when I suddenly noticed the crowd around the bunker. Holy shit, this is unbelievable. Shaker paced back and forth. I asked you to build a goddamn bunker. A bunker. What did you do? A fucking pile of shit under a burlap sack. That's what you did. The bunker collapsed. Trees and steel plates were sticking out in all directions, and in the middle of it all were bags of soggy sand. The mountain of rubble was only 2 feet high. Fuck you guys. Shaker walked away in a rage. I guess I should have built thicker walls, Ressler concluded. Practically every single person in the company worked hard every day. The new tents were growing like mushrooms, and their cable ties were getting in the way. The company road was ready. We dug ditches around the tents and continued to uproot stumps in the Gulf Zone. The bunker project had been put on hold. I was still living in a camping tent, but I was able to greatly reduce my chances of getting a snake bite by having a cot squeezed inside. It helped. The cleanup lines continued, even when only chips and sawdust remained of the trash. Fresh dirt scattered everywhere served as proof of the work done. A few lucky men from the company drove commanders to neighboring units at Pleiku, 50 miles to the west, to Quayanyong, and even as far as Saigon, 260 miles to the south. Our commanders, along with their comrades, used these trips to get important information on building bunkers and other things, scout out the situation, grab a beer, and get laid. When we were done, we'd spritz ourselves with water from the tanker trailer and sponge off, using our combat helmets as basins. The higher commanders showered in Special Forces camps. Just when I was beginning to think I had been sold into slavery, I had the honor of taking Shaker to Pleiku. I brought along a clean set of clothes and a photography kit. The military Special Forces guest camps in Pleiku had showers. Besides, I had finally gotten a chance to fly in the last 2 weeks. Shaker's company was more like total solitude. He didn't say a word on the whole round trip. Perhaps he was giving me a test, but in that case it was a silent test. The guest campground was gorgeous. I walked the sidewalk, took a shower, squandered some change at the slot machines, and bought some stuff at the garrison store, including a small camera. I should have waited and gotten a good camera. Wendell scrutinized my 16mm Minolta when I got back to the company. A good camera, like a Nikon F. You think so? I was starting to regret buying it. I took it for a couple shots. When the store gets some decent cameras, I'll pick something up, or when we get our own store. When you get ready, take me with you, Wendell suggested. I know everything about any camera. The day after the flight to Pleiku, I saw Vietnamese for the first time. Hundreds of Vietnamese. We're clearing the area right here. Shaker pointed to a spot outside the northern perimeter, gathering us around the map in the operations tent for a gas station. The Vietnamese are working on it. They started a couple days ago, and now it's our turn to send a spotter. Mason, get ready. What exactly are we supposed to do? Just watch. They got a Vietnamese foreman who knows what's what. You're supposed to make sure they work and don't screw around. No screwing around? We found stakes that pointed straight to our machine gun and mortar positions. There's got to be Viet Cong among the workers. The Vietnamese vans were already at the clearing site when SGT. Myers brought me there in a jeep. 4 big 2.5-ton trucks brought 150 refugees, men, women and children, who I was told were only too happy for a chance to earn a little extra money. The men were paid 100 piastres a day, the women and children 75 each. When Myers and I stopped, the truck drivers allowed the workers to get out. I had no idea what to do next, but the foreman stepped in. Black pajamas with conical hats spilled out of the trucks and hurried purposefully in different directions while the boss shouted orders. A few teenagers hesitated at one of the trucks, and the foreman immediately flew toward them, kicking them. He'd make a great sergeant. Within 5 minutes I was in the center of the Vietnamese peasants, swinging machetes and flashing axes, gradually expanding the boundaries of the clearing area and shredding the forest like big, angry termites. The foreman looked around, made sure everyone had something to do, and headed toward me with a broad smile. "Okay, Davai?" That was the word for captain. Neither of us knew what warrant was in Vietnamese. "Uh-huh. I see you've cleaned up the place. You good?" "Yeah." "Uh-huh. Uh-huh. What's your name?" "Mian. DV." I saw a group of teenagers talking while looking at the camp. "What are those guys doing there?" I pointed with my hand. Nguyen followed my gesture and irritably blurted out a few words, after which the guys got to work. "Viet Cong? Maybe Nguyen is Viet Cong? Who's Viet Cong around here anyway? So far the Viet Cong were just a rumor to me, a nocturnal noise outside the camp." The logging continued under the blazing sun. The kids dragged branches to the center of the circle and set them on fire. Sweat poured off everyone in rivulets. I was sweating just from sitting on the felled tree. The air was soaked with sweat. "SGT." Myers came out of the jeep, sweating too. "What are your orders, sir?" "Orders," I thought to myself. "Orders? What the fuck are orders? Do I have a jungle clearing specialist sign on me? I'm a pilot, you're a sergeant? Sergeants are supposed to know what they're supposed to do. Everybody knows that." "Okay," I finally said. "Go around the circle, Sergeant, and keep an eye on the workers. Oh yeah, don't forget the signs." "Signs, sir?" "Yes, these men can leave marks on the ground that point toward our defensive positions." "Understood." He turned and walked away. I decided to give him the advice I'd always heard from others. "Be careful, Sergeant." He turned around and nodded gravely. While talking to Myers, I moved away from the tree that served as my bench. When I walked back, Nguyen was talking to a wounded little girl sitting on a log. When the girl saw me, she jumped to her feet, but Nguyen barked at her and she quickly sat down. She had a 2-inch cut on her ankle. Nguyen wiped the wound with the dirty flap that served as his head bandage. I called out to Myers, who was staring malevolently at one of the female workers 50 feet away, and asked him to fetch a first aid kit from the jeep. The girl cautiously watched me with curiosity and fear. When Myers returned with the first aid kit, Nguyen stepped aside, not hiding his resentment. In the girl's dark eyes there was obvious fear, for she had fallen into the clutches of an American. She must have had such thoughts. "Allow me, sir," said Myers. He rolled up her black silk pant leg above the knee and began to clean the wound with a cotton swab soaked in hydrogen peroxide. The wound turned a pink foam, and the girl whimpered. I don't think she had ever seen the effects of hydrogen peroxide before. I asked Nguyen to tell her it's good medicine. "Good?" He was surprised. "Yes. It's good," I nodded. "Tell her." He did, and the girl smiled. When she wandered off to lunch with her family, I decided I would learn Vietnamese from her. I told Nguyen about my plans. After a lunch of dry rations for Myers and me and rice with unidentified vegetables for the Vietnamese, the girl sat down with me in a tree. She gave her real name, but insisted that I call her by her American name. A wonderful, innocent girl from another part of the planet insisted I call her Sally. It was depressing. I memorized words by pointing to objects and writing their names in notebooks. By evening I had written down many words, among them "watch damn ho," knife kaizova, teeth sing. We spent an hour making sentences from the new words. In the process, the girl relaxed and began to smile. I heard Nian yelling and looked up. He was swearing at a group of men in the southern part of the clearing. I spotted Myers, who was sleeping in the jeep with his hat pulled over his face. I got up and looked around. At the north end, I saw a man sitting on the grass, right in the center of the flickering machetes. Just as I was contemplating what was happening, Sally tapped me on the shoulder. When she taught me what a certain thing was called in Vietnamese, I would call her the English word. She tapped my shoulder because I was ogling around instead of teaching her English. I snapped back as she slammed down on our bench. That wasn't what she meant. I rose to my feet and walked toward the jeep. On the way, I turned around to see the man who had previously been sitting on the grass. Now he was sprawled out to his full height. That was the last straw. You give them a finger, they'll bite your arm off. I called Nguyen. Go and tell that guy to get up. I pointed to the faker who lay 100 yards away. Nguyen sprang from his seat. Get up, Sergeant, I said when I reached the jeep. Myers swayed forward and dropped his hat. My bad, sir. I was on guard duty all night. Looks like he wasn't lying. All right, but try to hang on for another hour until we leave. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. When Myers left, I looked for Nguyen. He was on his way back. Behind him, the man was still asleep. What's the matter, Nian? He's not working anymore, Davi. He's dead. Dead? I blinked. Did you say dead? Yes. Nguyen nodded convincingly. There must be some mistake. The dumb gook doesn't know what he's talking about. The guy fell asleep and Nguyen is trying to protect him. If the guy was dead or dying, everyone gathered around him would obviously say something. Maybe they're joking around. Is Nguyen a Viet Cong trapping me to chop me to pieces? Myers wouldn't even pay attention to that in case. I headed toward the sleeping man. Nguyen ran beside me. Maybe this guy is a relative of his. Nguyen, I know the guy is sleeping, so don't try to stop me. Nguyen didn't answer. A lump came up to my throat, but I couldn't understand why. The man didn't get up when I stood next to him. He curled up snugly in the grass while gnats and flies swarmed in the calluses on his feet. He wasn't breathing. Emerging from somewhere, Myers knelt down and checked the lad's pulse on his throat. He's dead, sir. Nguyen showed what had killed the guy. 6 feet from the body lay a decapitated snake. Among the countless blisters and cuts on his leg, the snakebite marks were visible. He had been bitten, killed the snake, and stooped down to die. His friends continued to work non-stop, paying no attention to him. They knew, and he himself knew, that if you are bitten by a snake, you die. And he died. At the end of the workday, the refugees lined up 50 feet from the trucks that arrived. The treasurer arrived just as the jeep was preparing to depart with the dead body for the camp medical center. He brought with him a black vinyl briefcase, which looked out of place in the jungle, and took out Vietnamese cash to pay the workers. As he handed out the money, I searched my eyes for Sally. I hadn't seen her since the snake incident. She was the only person I knew outside the army. She seemed kind and cheerful. I was beginning to wonder how I could save her from such a horrible life, but I could never find her. As I looked around at the workers, I noticed a boy in one of the front rows stepping on an older man's foot while he was walking backward. Without a second thought, the man slammed his clenched fist down on the kid's head. The boy sagged down, almost falling, grimaced in pain, but didn't say a word. The trucks pulled away. Myers and I did one last check before we left. We found 3 different arrows indicating the location of our sand fortifications around the perimeter of the camp. The notches on the stalks most likely marked the distance. We erased them. That evening I drove to an key village with Shaker, Faris and Resler. It was an official trip. We were to buy various utensils for personal use: candles, oil lamps, rice mats, and plastic deck chairs. Resler and I went as movers. The village was small and impersonal. Along the way we spotted a few other parked jeeps. One of the bars seemed lively, but Shaker wouldn't have let us inside for the life of us. Looking around the streets of the village, I pondered the possibility that the refugees who were working today to clear a site for a gas station might live here. But I didn't see any familiar faces. "Mason, we found a couple of army tents this morning," Ressler announced to me through the tarp. I hadn't gotten up yet. He usually pushed me up for breakfast. "We've been ordered to leave the camping tents but leave them in place." "Why?" I inquired languidly. "They want to make a warehouse out of them. They'll put 20 soldiers in the general-purpose tents, so you'll have nowhere to store your golf clubs and polo clubs." That's great news. The army tents were made of thick khaki-coloured tarps stretched along a long ridge beam. The sides of the tent were rolled upward during the day, because the dark colour of the tarp absorbed so much heat that you could get a scalding charge of spun air in your face when you entered the tent. The combination of heat and moisture gave rise to a tremendous amount of mould and mildew. The tents were deserted during the day, not only because of the heat, but also because everyone was ploughing outside. That evening, the group of camping tent lovers moved into a comfortable new general-purpose tent. Our 9 beds were lined up in a row on one side of the tent. Another 10 beds were lined up opposite. Only 6 inches separated my bunk from Nate's bunk on the right. John Hall of the advance squad positioned himself 6 inches to the left. Wendell and Barber nestled just across the aisle. Inside it was possible to stand upright. During our first overnight stay, we discussed replacing the commanding officer, Major Fields. A lingering ear inflammation had caused him to be suspended. At a special meeting before dinner, he announced his discharge to Saigon and introduced his replacement, Major Williams. For more than 2 years, Fields had remained his go-to guy for soldiers, despite his rank. It was clear from Williams that we would soon learn the ins and outs of Army regulations. I have the utmost respect for Major Fields and appreciate his accomplishments at Bravo Company. "I can see with my own eyes how much you've accomplished here," he didn't smile, as he looked over our uneven formation near the mess hall. "But from tomorrow the pace of work will increase. We will have a lot of work to do on the company site. There will be a lot of different tasks and training flights. Training is the key to successful survival. And we are surviving here, gentlemen." His thick eyebrows drew together over the bridge of his nose. Harsh lines danced at the corners of his lips as he talked about the upcoming missions. His face matched his occupation perfectly. "I'd like to stay here and work in the Gulf Zone," Connors said as he stepped into the crowded warrant tent. "But our new commander is sending me out tomorrow morning with good old Mason." Great, I pulled back from cleaning my new .38 caliber Smith Wesson. "Who else is flying?" I tucked the shiny long-barreled revolver with the wooden grip back into the black holster on my hip. We'd been issued these cowboy guns yesterday in exchange for old .45 caliber Colts. Great toy for pilots. "Everybody's flying. Our company's sending 4 cars. You and me, Nate and Ressler, Wendell and Barber, Hall and Marston." They could hardly keep their eyes off their .38s. Connors pounced on Hall. "Damn, boys. Are you guys getting ready for a shootout at the OK Corral?" "Don't get confused," Buddy Hall retorted, spinning the drum of the revolver. He snapped it back into place and took aim at the tent ridge, gripping the revolver with both hands. "We're not in the OK Corral. We're in the mad jungle. A gunfight in the mad jungle." Hall winked and drained the cap of his flask in one gulp. "The combat mission to which we were assigned was simple: an early morning flight over an key pass toward Quinyong between 2 skinny mountain ranges, take a left and up toward the Vin Thun Valley, which we called the Valley of Happiness, drop off scout teams, and then return to the landing zone near the pass and hangar. The infantry could request assistance. The division sent out such reconnaissance teams from the moment they arrived. This was the first time we were fortunate enough to participate in the process. The soldiers assembled on the 3rd row in the Gulf area. Each group of 10 was assigned to its own helicopter. While we were doing pre-flight training, the soldiers watched us as if we could run away at any moment. On the occasion of my first combat mission, I put on my cleanest field uniform and body armor, grabbed my brand new .38 in a hip holster, and pulled on a pair of real flight gloves. We still couldn't get breast protection. I climbed into the cockpit of the Huey, plugged my helmet into the radio cord, hung it over my head, and climbed back out to help Connors with the pre-flight inspection. You have no idea how many dumb bastards have ruined themselves by giving a damn or putting a bolt on the pre-flight inspection. Memorize everything I'm going to show you now and repeat it before every flight. I nodded. We stood at the cargo bay on the left side of the helicopter. First thing we'll do is check the trip sheet. He unfolded the document. People often don't notice the big red cross the chief mechanic put on the first page. Always read his notes. Remember that this is his car and he is the chief mechanic. You're just checking his work, so always read what he writes about the condition of the helicopter. Connors folded up the trip sheet and pushed it into a pocket behind the center panel. Then he squatted down next to the helicopter. Everyone knows to drain a little fuel before the first flight to drive out condensation. He pointed under the belly of the Huey. I bet most sons of bitches never do that. I crawled on all fours to the fuel drain valve, pushed on it, and drained a few drops of fuel onto the ground. There was no water inside. Connors continued his inspection, telling me about the important details he thought were often neglected by the others. He knew the machine by heart and was ideally suited to be an instructor pilot. We checked the tail rotor. I unwound the mooring strap from the propeller and removed it. We walked to the right side of the helicopter, and Connors climbed up using the hidden steps between the pilot's door and the cargo bay door. I followed him. The Huey's flat roof allowed me to walk around quietly while checking the main rotor hub and shaft, gearbox cushion, and track control linkage. Connors showed me the control wires of the tilt washer, tubular linkage, stabilizer rod, and control system dampers. At dawn, we climbed into the cockpit. Spiderweb cracks were clearly showing on the plastic lantern housing. A guy named Red, the chief mechanic of our car, helped me buckle the straps on the right side. The sun had already flooded the cabin, and the air inside was heating up fast. Dark spots began to blur around my belt, and I could feel the sweat dripping down my concealed derringer. Not a good idea to carry it around with me. I put on my sunglasses. Connors watched from the left seat in the classic pose of the instructor pilot who doesn't give a shit but keeps a close eye on the rookie. He crossed his arms over his body armor and pointed his head forward, but squinted his eyes in my direction. I did a memory check of the instruments and looked at the lead vehicle, which stood 2 helicopters to the right. 2 sweaty minutes later, the link commander from the Snake helicopter waved his hand, giving the go-ahead to start the engine. The starter shrieked, the propellers slowed, the turbine caught a spark. The propellers turned into a blur. We were ready for takeoff. I turned on the comms and checked the readiness of the chief mechanic with the gunner. There were affirmative clicks in response. Don't forget to have them check the doors, Connors reminded me. I nodded and had the guys check the pins that held the 2 sliding doors open. The pins were in place. Without them, the doors could have snapped off the rails and flown off with a gust of wind. Soon 16 unarmed and 4 attack helicopters were ready to take off on the 3rd row. Soldiers stood nearby waiting for us to start pulling out of the parking lots. The squad leader broke us into groups of 4 helicopters and assigned each squad a different color as a call sign in strict color order: yellow, white, orange, red. Within our own squad, we had a number to designate our position in formation. Connors and I were orange 4. Each car called out its color and number in turn. When the line got to our squad, I heard, Orange 1, Marston. Orange 2, Wendell. Orange 3, Nate. Orange 4, I said. The red squad was following us. We hovered above the ground, pulled out of the parking lot, and dropped down at the end of a long line of cars in the middle of the 3rd row. Soldiers, or, as Connors corrected me, grunts, began to hop aboard. They were in field uniforms for the jungle and carried belt pouches, M16 carbines, M79 grenade launchers, hand grenades, and flasks. That was the end of their arsenal. They belonged to our division, so we were constantly bringing them supplies. 3 soldiers squeezed in between the chief mechanic and the machine gunner on a long bench across the cargo bay. 3 more sat on the floor opposite, and the rest settled 2 at a time by the door. 10 grunts. Claire. Why did they start calling them grunts? I asked as the Marines scrambled around the back. Intelligence, Connors answered. I hope they didn't hear that. Don't worry, Mason. We're all grumblers here. You didn't volunteer for the army, did you? I did. Then I'm outta here. Red 4 called the squad leader and informed him that all 16 slicks were ready. Yellow 1 confirmed, and a few seconds later took off leisurely. The helicopters followed each other tightly. As Orange 1, Marston and Hall got off the ground, I began to add gas to ease the pressure of the Huey on the skids. The nose of the car lifted a little and it slid into place. I levelled off the drift and waited in full gear. When Nate and Resler lifted off, I immediately took off after them, feeling the weight of the grunts in the cargo hold. Yellow 1 slowly gained altitude over the trees north of the camp, holding speed at 60 knots as we gathered into a wedge. When the formation closed, it made a slow turn to the right toward An Key Pass. As the fourth helicopter, I joined the left flank of the formation, which already had 3 vehicles flying in it, and provided a lead on the left side of the wedge. As I approached Orange 3 on the left flank, I thought he was lagging behind, so I lowered the throttle. Then I thought he was pulling away too much, so I had to nosedive forward to catch up with him. The lack of practice flying in formation was taking its toll. I kept jerking back and forth. Connors watched for a while and couldn't take it anymore. "I'll take it." Transmitting. Taking control, he built back in and formed a straight line with Orange 1 and Orange 3. We were going so close to Orange 3 that I could hear the whirring of its tail rotor. "Would you like me to teach you how to dance to the formation tune?" Connors offered. His smile was half hidden by the microphone. "You need to find 2 points on the Huey that's flying in front of you in formation and get in at a 45-degree angle to their tail. I take the intersection of the rear strut of Orange 3's left slider as the first point and superimpose it on the front strut of his right slider. See?" I saw the 2 dots merge into one, slowly moving relative to each other as the car floated gently through the air. While Connors was pointing at the dots, we were travelling at 80 knots over the highway toward the pass. It's a great reference point when you're flying level with another car. You need the same landmark to take higher if they have to turn around, or if you get a tree in the way. When the landmark points overlap, you're going at the right angle. Connors suddenly lifted us up above the formation. "Look at the roof of the Orange 3, the propellers flashed over the vent nozzle, and the antennas on the roof. I take the vent nozzle on this side and superimpose it over the front corner of the roof. By combining the 2 points, we were at the correct angle to Orange 3. Descending back down to the previous level, Connors pronounced. When flying in formation, always look for your own reference points for each position. That's the only way you'll know when you're in a jam. And if you're having a hard time now, imagine the shit that goes on at night." "Night formation?" "Uh-huh. The trick is to stay close enough to see the other guy's dash lights. About the same distance as the rotating propeller. Then you learn to get even closer." He made it very simple. I was determined to become a pro like him. I was so engrossed in his stories that I didn't even notice that we had crossed the pass. "Take it," he said. I got it. The waypoints helped me a lot. Soon I was flying at the right angle, not lagging or jerking forward. "Now hold us at a mental angle of 45 degrees and try to get away from the landmark and then come back. Regardless of the distance, the points should overlap." As I was being carried back, I pondered how Red 1 was looking at our maneuvers. Orange 3 and Orange 1 continued to fly in formation. Sticking to my point of reference, I stayed out of Red 1's way. When I was 100 yards away from Orange 3, I accelerated gently to return to my position. After making sure the landmark was in place, I raised my nose to get further away from it. I was doing great, but this was not a training flight. While I was catching up with the car ahead of me, the whole formation turned left, following Yellow 1. I had to drop the throttle to avoid a collision. "You have to anticipate turns," Connors explained. "As soon as you see Orange 3 start to lean to turn in front of you, you have to lean more and slow down because you're on the inside radius of the turn. If you are on the outside, be prepared to throttle up to stay in line. A bit like flicking a whip." I obediently slowed down and stayed in line, but as the cars aligned north toward Happy Valley, I again failed to react in time and fell behind. As I got into formation, I felt like a green cadet. "Closer," Connors commanded. I thought I was at the right distance, but I followed his order. "Closer." Day. Jesus, we're going to hit another car. I flew up to Orange 3 so close I could clearly see Ressler through the left door. He turned and waved. I heard the whirring of their tail rotor again. Too close.